Assalamu alaikum. Good evening to you all, and thank you all for attending, zooming in when we probably had all of us too much of Zoom, and I'm sure that particularly applies to our Victorian friends. The country I'm speaking from is Gadigal country of the Eora people, and I acknowledge their traditional custodianship of the land, whose sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my respects to Indigenous elders, past, present and emerging. My presentation follows in two halves, the first on the historical materialist concept of ideology and the second on Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemony. I'll continue by arguing that the negative or critical concept of ideology advanced by Jorge Larraín, which I'll propound in the first half, is not only complementary to the theory of hegemony, as Larraín argues, but is consistent with it. Perhaps a brief comment about theory to start this theory time. I'm not a theorist, by the way, but I'm going to talk to you about theories that I've found useful and theorists that I've found inspiring in my own work. I sometimes joke glibly about theory, F-E-A-R-Y, since often postgraduates and early career researchers find it scary and tend to fetishise it as something magic, a sort of a priestly formula. Theory is just an organised, coherent way of explaining the world. Not just explaining, but explaining it in order to act effectively in the world, to transform the world consciously, which is essential to our humanity. We all do it. At an everyday level all the time. This is a key understanding in Gramsci, as I hope to convey later. One of the reasons that I recommended the readings from Larraín and Davidson is that they showed how the theories of ideology and of hegemony progress with the development of the social thought of Marx and later Gramsci. Both Larraín and Davidson make the point also that theory can't remain fixed, but must be made relevant to the time. It must change as historical change takes place. It's not a matter of identifying adherence to or departure from the canon, but of the usefulness of the body of thought for explaining and progressively changing the social world. Okay, the term ideology is commonly used in everyday language and indeed in some social science to mean a consistent set of understandings about the social world, especially in connection with politics and morality, which informs social practice. This is what I'll call, following Larraín, the neutral concept of ideology. Neutral because it contains no built-in judgment about truth or falsity in these understandings. There is, however, a pejorative sense in the ordinary usage when we talk about ideologues. An ideologue's always someone else, it's never us. It suggests some sort of systematic distortion in favour of particular interests. We need a social scientific theory to grasp just how ideology works that way and to conceive of an ideology that does so. Larraín discerns what he terms a critical or negative concept of ideology in the work of Marx, which he argues to be his predominant usage of the term and of the notion, consistent in its main thrust throughout the development of Marx's work. As an aside, I should acknowledge that there's a controversy about this assertion within the historical materialist tradition, and also about the usefulness of that concept as against the neutral one. For the purposes of this half of my talk, I'm following Larraín. You'll see from his Theory, Culture and Society article that I recommended that he contends against Stuart Hall that ideology in its negative sense is useful for explaining the authoritarian populism of Thatcherism. In our period of crisis currently, with its profound and global growth of right-wing populism, together with nationalism and racism, I find it to be a useful part of the theoretical toolkit. Excuse me. The negative conception involves a form of distortion in understandings of the social world, which arise from and obscure social contradictions. It's often presented by Marx through the metaphor of inversion. There's also a metaphor of reflection engaged here. These distortions in people's consciousness of the world reflect distortions in people's material existence. One of the earliest accounts of this process in Marx, indeed before he uses the word ideology, is in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Here he takes up Feuerbach's materialist critique of religion, reversing the conventional idealist conception. Man makes religion, religion does not make man. Yet identifying this inversion is not enough. It's not a matter of pure fantasy. Quoting, man, that is humanity, is the world of man, state, society. Marx argues that this state and this society produce religion as an inverted consciousness of the world because they are in an inverted world. It's an expression of real contradictions. To quote again, religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. So ideology is not a chimera. It's not just misconceived ideas. It has a reality to it. It's this element of reality that gave Thatcherite ideology its purchase among British people, as Hall and his collaborators emphasised. We could look for the same sort of thing in Trump's appeal during his last election campaign. To investigate this would involve, as Marx and Engels suggest in the German ideology, and I quote, not setting out from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as narrated, thought of, imagined, conceived, in order to arrive at men in the flesh, but setting out from real active men on the basis of their real life process, demonstrating the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. The phantoms formed in the brains of men are also necessarily supplements of their material life process. And I apologise for the 19th century gender-specific language, but there's not much I can do about that. That's there. Ideology, moreover, can't be countered by argument alone, confronting ideas with other ideas. The German ideology observes that the demand to change consciousness amounts to a demand to interpret the existing world in a different way, in no way combating the real existing world when they are combating solely the phrases of this world. That is to say, ideology must be overcome in human practice, in resolving by superseding the real contradictions of the distorted social life that produce distorted consciousness, a point Marx makes in his sixth thesis on Feuerbach. As summed up eloquently in the famous 11th thesis, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And I think that point was well understood, as I'll argue, by Gramsci. It might be helpful at this stage if I give some examples of ideology as inversion. One contemporary and long-standing instance comes to mind, all too frequently, is what's been called the myth of the dangerous black man. This racist ideology of the criminal, violent, threatening black or brown person, usually male, has been drawn upon by Donald Trump in his current election campaign. Now, you've probably all seen the horrific video or photos from May this year of one of 4 arresting Minneapolis police officers kneeling on the neck of Black American George Floyd, squeezing the life out of him as he pleaded for his life and gasped no less than 20 times that he couldn't breathe. Now, who's dangerous here? Who's in danger? the ideology stands the real relations on their head, or as Marx and Engels put it, men and their relations appear upside down, as in a camera obscura. Throughout the whole history of kidnapping, enslavement and transportation to the Americas of thousands of people from Africa for the profit of white men of wealth, then generations of brutal violence, dehumanisation and extraction of slave labour, then upon formal emancipation, segregation and suppression and further exploitation enforced by lynchings and mass incarceration and executions, and the ongoing to this day humiliation, beatings, jailings and killings by agents of the state have all been obscured by the myth of the dangerous black man who must be controlled for the safety of ordinary Americans, who are construed in the myth as not black and not dangerous. Of course, we have a similar ideology here in Australia that operates by an analogous inversion. Here, numerous black deaths in custody still going on are represented not as killings, but as unfortunate accidents that arise in course of keeping the community safe from dangerous black people, mostly men. The 147th Aboriginal death in custody since the Royal Commission reported in 1991 was that of Cameron Doomadgee, or Mulrunji. He was killed by police on Palm Island in 2004, 4 ribs broken, his liver ripped apart and his spleen crushed through the application of a knee. He'd been arrested for singing in the street after celebrating his daughter's birth. The killer was eventually acquitted, yet Aboriginal protesters were widely denounced by the media, duly outraged, and by outraged politicians, outraged at the protests rather than the killing, as lawless and violent, leading to arrest, criminal conviction and imprisonment for riot. As of this year, there have been 437 Indigenous deaths in custody since the Royal Commission. In 2015, Dunghutti man David Dungay was killed in Longbrae Prison, forcibly restrained by 5 officers of the prison's immediate action team. 12 times he said, "I can't breathe," but he was held face down, unable to take air, until he died. The violent intervention was occasioned by his continuing to eat a packet of Tim Tams biscuits when he'd been ordered not to. The coroner said he was no security risk. He was due for parole in 3 weeks. He posed no danger at that stage, but he was in danger. I'll give one last example of camera obscura type ideology before we move on. You might recall Pauline Hanson's assertion during the 1997 election campaign, or if you can't recall it, you will have heard it many times since, that Indigenous Australians received so-called special privileges. It was not her own invention, it's commonplace and all the more effective as ideology for that. Here we see the most discriminated against, least advantaged people in the Australian population on any social indicators: life expectancy, health, levels of formal education, housing, wealth or lack of it, income, unemployment, levels of incarceration, represented as if they were inequitably advantaged. This audacious inverting of real social relations conveniently denies the ongoing inequalities endured by Indigenous people. And it also distracts from the historical realities of the colonialist expropriation of their land, the disruption and destruction of their culture, unpaid labour, sexual violence and exploitation, taking away and institutionalisation of their children over generations, systematic exclusion from education, employment and other key social institutions, with all the rest of the sorry history and unconscionable legacy. This sort of inversion not only distorts, it works to obscure an important part of social reality. So let's continue now with tracing Marx's development in theorising ideology as mapped by Larraín. The works of the mature Marx, beginning with the Grundrisse and culminating in Capital, are focused on political economy, and primarily on the political economy of capitalism. Marx at this stage no longer uses the term ideology very much, but Larraín argues that his method of discerning it in distortions, in inversions of reality that both manifest and obscure contradictions, remain consistent. The model contains further complexities of different levels of social reality, superficial appearances, which are nevertheless real, and underlying essences in production relations. The accessibility and visibility of the appearances hide the operation of the essential. This is easier to grasp if we think of appearances as associated with the market, with the free and equal exchange of commodities, including money as wages and the labour power exchanged for them, and the underlying essences as associated with the necessarily exploitative production of surplus value, the ultimate source of profit and means by which the capitalist accumulates wealth. Marx and Engels had much earlier in the Communist Manifesto expounded that all class societies are based on relations between two fundamental social classes, a class of direct producers from whom surplus is extracted, and a ruling class which extracts and expropriates that surplus. In slave societies, slaves and their owners. In feudal societies, serfs and the landowning aristocracy. In capitalist society, wage labourers and capitalists. In the theory of ideology of the later Marx, he is arguing that while the exploitation of feudalism was much more open and obvious, in that part of the working day spent working for the Lord, as against that part spent sustaining the serf family, in capitalism it's hidden away by our fixation on the market. Wage labour is purchased at its full exchange value, but when it's put to work, it adds more value in the production of commodities than the value of the wage that the worker is paid. This surplus value becomes profit when the commodities are sold and accrues to the capitalist, who owns the factories and raw materials and other means of production, just as capitalists own and can deploy the labour power once they have purchased it. At the level of appearances, there's an exchange of equal values in a contract freely entered into. At the underlying, essential level of production relations takes place the extraction of surplus value that accrues solely to the capitalist through labour performed entirely by the worker. As this process continues in a cycle, the surplus value in turn becomes capital, which can then be routinely reinvested, spent to purchase more labour power, as well as raw materials and other prerequisites of production. The worker's labour power is thus bought with capital that's been I've lost my place, that an earlier stage has been surplus value. So the labourer is confronted with capital that's accrued from his or her own dead labour. Labour power used up to create the earlier surplus value. Now, this isn't apparent to the worker who sees it merely as wages. The reality at different levels is both. Right? Both the free and equal exchange in the market and the extraction of surplus at the level of essential production relations, both of these are real and material. Marx writes in Capital of the wage form as this phenomenal form which makes the actual relations invisible and indeed shows the direct opposite of the relation. It forms the basis of all the juridical norms of both labourer and capitalist and all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, of all its illusions as to liberty. He explains how the extraction of surplus value in the labour process remains invisible by its conflation with profit. Surplus value does not appear as the product of the expropriation of labour time, but as an excess of the selling price of commodities over their cost price. This fixation upon the market is a general aspect of ideology under capitalism. Capitalism is a commodity society. Most production to meet human needs takes place via production of commodities, that is, goods and services to be sold on the market, where labour power is sold like any other commodity, in exchange for money, the generalisable commodity. The relationships between human beings appear as relationships between commodities in the fetishism of commodities. Lorraine argues in his 1991 Theory, Culture and Society article that the British state under Thatcher moved to address the crisis of accumulation that had set in from the mid-70s in Britain through intensifying the extraction of surplus value, basically lowering wages, and increasing the rate of exploitation and cutting back on the welfare state. Thus, after 3 decades of the welfare state and the associated social democratic ideology of redressing inequality and curbing the deleterious effects of the untrammelled market, there was now a forceful return to the ideology of the market in terms of freedom, equality, the national benefits of individual self-interest, the efficiency of the hidden hand. You'll recognise this as the economics and the accompanying ideology of neoliberalism, which at Thatcher's time and that of her contemporary US President Ronald Reagan, we called the New Right. Since 1980-odd, neoliberalism has been quite hegemonic, though it may now be encountering a crisis of hegemony. Okay, that's my signal to start talking about the theory of hegemony and the contribution of Antonio Gramsci, but I might give you a little break from listening to me at this stage and allow the opportunity of raising questions via Mona.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. We've got a question actually from Barbel. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. The question is, what do you think the difference is between religious ideas or faiths and ideology?
Sorry about my photo. I'm dark in the background, so I might.
Hello, Barbel.
Not a problem, Barbel.
It's Barbel. Pronunciation B-A-E-R-B-E-L, and it's got the note above the A.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that.
Little Barb.
No, Little Barb. That's okay. Whatever you want to say. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just interested when you talk about ideology, and I'm interested in. I did my PhD in philosophy and it was studio-based research with art, but I am interested in religion and ideology and changing ideas about ecology and our relation to nature. So I'm just sort of thinking what you're saying with Marxism. What am I trying to say? Religion, in a way, is an ideology, and wasn't it Marx that said any ideology is false? Am I right with saying that?
What is a flaw? Did you say?
I thought Marx said that any ideology is necessarily false.
Yeah, that's been a common misrepresentation of Marx. The point is not that, and it's true that Marx, in common with the cruder materialists of his time that he was criticising for their crudity, regarded religion as ideology. And later on, Marxists who spoke in terms of the superstructures of ideology, politics, and legal relationships built upon an economic base. They talked about religion as part of ideology in that sense. But the point about the notion of falsity, or rather mystification, or distortion, or sort of I shouldn't call them mechanisms, but ways that hide reality from human beings. The point about that for Marx isn't that that ideology, including religion, is merely false. In fact, there's a truth to it, and expresses truly the suffering of suffering people. But it seeks it seeks a resolution in the mystical life of religion of that real suffering. So it seeks to resolve the contradictions of material life at the level of ideology. So it's a bit more complicated, but you're right that both Marx and later, as we'll see, Gramsci were critical of religion, although Gramsci was careful not to be dismissive of it. And I'll talk about that later.
Yeah, thank you very much, Scott. Thank you, Babu. Another question from Holly, and the question is, with the Marxist version of ideology, does the social reality come first and is then mystified or inverted, or does ideology constitute a social reality?
The second.
The second.
Both the essential relations of production and ideology are real and material and have material effects. Okay, so both are real, but for Marx, the ideological arises from the essential relations of production rather than the other way around. That's not to say that it can't have any effect on them. And as I'll say in a little while, there have been interminable debates within the historical materialist tradition about how much effect and which way the causality goes and to what extent. But it's clear that, and it's an important point about ideology as appearances, to make the point that appearances are real. You know, just as this image on the screen, although it's an image, is real. It's an image of something, but it's also real.
Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
I do too.
Yeah, no, this was actually an important question because I was going to ask it, but in a different way. Because sometimes it's a bit confusing whether ideology is influenced by cultural and political aspects, or whether the culture and political reality influences ideology. So I think I'm asking the same question, but in a different manner.
No, the earlier question was, I think, about the economic relations. Okay. and whether they determine ideology or the other way around. Okay. So your reference was to politics and culture, which, according to the, in my understanding, quite unhelpful notion of ideology, politics and culture all occurring somehow up there in the superstructural plane, belong to a different level called the superstructures, which are determined by production relations at at the base. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's been a very common understanding and a common representation of Marxism as a whole. I guess my point is that it doesn't represent Marxism as a whole, and it's often used very crudely to misrepresent the historical materialist tradition.
Sure, thank you. I've got one more question from Amira. She's asking, may I know how theory of hegemony works?
I'm going to spend 40 minutes talking about that. Closer to 20 minutes. So I will answer that question as best I can very soon.
Okay, maybe we'll go to our next section then. I can see there's a lot of questions leading us to that section too.
Okay, thank you, Mana.
Thank you.
So I think it's necessary to start with a few words about the concept of ideology that I haven't been talking about. The one which Larraín terms the neutral concept, and which he identifies with Gramsci, among other theorists. There is in the work of Marx and Engels a second concept of ideology that doesn't have the same negative sense as the one that Larraín propounds, as I've been explicating. It's not the one about inversion and distortion, but something quite else. This concept encompasses all forms of consciousness of the social world that are held within a given society. It posits ideology in this sense as an ideational superstructure arising from or based on the foundations of the relations of production. This is a metaphor of levels, one that views the level of ideology in this sense as operating somehow distinctly from the economic, yet crucially shaped by it, and also capable of having some effect on it, though the extent of these forms of determination in either direction have been argued about interminably within Marxism, as I mentioned earlier. One of Marx's works that clearly inspired Gramsci is his preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, where he sets out the base superstructure model in a way that's often been interpreted as deterministic. And look, I'm sorry for the longish quote, but here we go. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production, appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundations, on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness, ideology in that sense. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. That's end of quote. There are some places in Marx and Engels' oeuvre where they suggest that particular forms of consciousness are associated with particular classes. Certainly in the German ideology, they write, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. So the same class of people that Rupert Murdoch belongs to put it crudely, own capital, and part of that capital is, a News Corporation and so forth, and we don't, and so we're subjected to the understandings of the world propounded in the Australian and the Daily Telegraph and Fox and so on and so forth. By that same class, crudely put. These relationships were of vital concern to Gramsci, who came to elaborate them over 80 years later and in a different context with more contingency and nuance, and rather more nuanced than the example that I just adduced. After Marx's death, the struggle to develop ideas that should inform and encourage working class revolution led to notions of bourgeois or capitalist ideology vis-a-vis working class ideology. Marx never wrote of working class ideology. He never wrote of ideology as belonging in this sense to the working class. However, there are notions that were taken up and elaborated, these were, by Gramsci, quite creatively. Lenin, preoccupied with and engaged in the politics of revolution, did deploy such understandings. They became bones of contention in Western Marxism, especially in the early second half of the 20th century. Bones notably picked over by structuralists such as Althusser and Poulantzas, names that are mentioned in the readings that I sent out. I can't discuss this here, but it was in many ways in reaction to the perceived determinism of this form of structuralist Marxism that a strand of Western Marxists, Stuart Hall amongst them notably, began to take up Gramsci. Their uses of Gramsci, as Davidson points out, were very different and differently motivated from those of the Italian communists of the post-war period. Antonio Gramsci was a Sardinian by birth, a linguist from his Turin University studies, a journalist by profession, and founder of the Communist Party of Italy, a founder, in 1921. He was the party's representative in the Communist International from 1922 to 1924, and the party's leader after his return to Italy following the arrest and imprisonment of co-founder Amedeo Bordiga. Gramsci had been an activist in the Socialist Party and a leader of the radical factory occupations and factory councils movement in Turin in 1920, when Italy was on the verge of revolution. That movement was defeated. Mussolini's fascists attained government from 1922 and installed an increasingly authoritarian regime which by 1926 banned all other political parties. Gramsci was arrested along with other party leaders and remained incarcerated by the fascist regime until shortly before his death. An inevitable death for want of medical treatment in 1937. A brilliant scholar and social and political analyst, Gramsci spent most of his prison term under dreadful conditions and under the eye of the prison censor, undertaking an enormous and wide-ranging study, handwritten on over 30 notebooks, comprising more than 3,000 pages on Italian history, politics and ideas, with a view to analysing the context and theorising the conditions of their movement's defeat, and setting out the theoretical underpinnings for historical Marxism to advance revolutionary politics and build a socialist society. Among his numerous and interrelated focuses were class relations, the state, bureaucracy, civil society, leadership, historical materialism, economism, determinism, philosophy, including ontology and epistemology, theory and practice, passive revolution, nationalism, fascism, the people, populism, popular culture, high culture, the church, folklore, common sense, intellectuals, both traditional and organic, the revolutionary political party, the law and legal system, pedagogy, education, the law, the schools, the press, propaganda, division of labour, Taylorism, Fordism, corporatism, and much else besides. Winding through all of this was the development of his major theoretical concept, hegemony. There may well be as many versions of what's meant by hegemony as there are of ideology. The word comes from a Greek source denoting leadership, but it's a very nuanced sort of leadership that Gramsci considers. Leadership of whom? By whom? By what means? To what ends? These questions have different answers at various places in the prison notebooks, depending on the topic in focus. In fact, there was an earlier discussion of what amounts to hegemony, though I don't think it was called that there, in an unfinished essay of 1926 that Gramsci wrote before his imprisonment, entitled Some Aspects of the Southern Question. The Southern question in question concerned this region's differences from the industrialised North in the contrasting politics, culture and interests of the peasants of the agricultural South, including his native Sardinia. Gramsci was reflecting on the failed factory councils movement and the prerequisites for a successful revolution led by the organised proletariat of the North. Clearly, an alliance of these two classes was necessary and had in fact been pursued. Both were subaltern strata, exploited and subjugated respectively by landowners of the South and industrial capitalists of the North. Under what conditions might such an alliance be possible? The peasants of the underdeveloped South were backward in their outlook, conservative in their politics, dominated by the traditional intellectuals, especially of the church, in service of the landowners. In order to ally with them, the organised workers of the North had to overcome the hitherto predominant ideology there, and Gramsci calls it ideology, that naturalises the southern peasants as biologically inferior, criminally inclined, lazy, stupid, and so on. You all recognise these tropes as akin to colonialism, and indeed the South stood in such a relationship to the North. The southern peasants, for their part, took some convincing that the workers of the North shared interests in common with them as working people, oppressed in one way or another by the capitalist class and its state. This was made invisible to the peasants because of the northern workers' relative prosperity compared to the very poor southerners. And Gramsci instances one Sardinian member of the Sassari Brigade sent by the state to suppress the strikers, who saw the factory workers as gentry because of their seemingly fine clothes, fine compared to what the agricultural workers of the South wore. A revolutionary party in 1926 would need to organise and mobilise the peasants of the South in an alliance led by the working class of the North, and in order to do so, they would need to detach them from the influence of the southern intellectuals who mediate in favour of the landowners. Gramsci suggests a way through a detailed analysis of the respective material interests and worldviews of these groups, taking into account the nuances of local cultures, histories, and alliances of class fractions. So here we have the element of a theory of how the working class can attain hegemony, a political alliance of classes or class fractions based on real common interests and requiring the perception of that commonality of interest. The alliance is led by a directive class or a class fraction, led because hegemony is leadership after all. The masses, in this case of poor peasants, to be recruited to the cause, need to be detached from traditional intellectuals who are in the service of the ruling class. And a revolutionary party is indispensable in organising this through developing organic intellectuals of its own. Much of the prison notebooks is concerned with the hegemony historically attained by the ruling class and how it is maintained through the role of intellectuals. The principles of alliance, interests and worldviews, political leadership and intellectual articulation are similar but more developed in the notebooks. The first form of hegemony is a sophisticated type of dominance that's not usually experienced as dominance. It's not ever experienced as dominance by those subordinated through it. It works predominantly through eliciting consent. This is the conception of hegemony that's most appealed to Western Marxists since the 1960s. The notebooks are also preoccupied with how that hegemony might be supplanted through the directiveness of a revolutionary party, with the organising principles for such a party and with the role of intellectuals organic to the working class within such a movement. This second and more Leninist understanding was of interest to the Italian Communist Party after the war, but was taken up less by social theorists in the West, especially as the shortcomings of the Soviet Union brought it into discredit and disfavour among Western left intellectuals. Both forms of hegemony involve intellectual and moral leadership in forging alliances and articulating interests. As the theory is crucially concerned with politics and ideology, Gramsci has been dubbed the theoretician of the superstructures among Western Marxists. I think this is misleading. Gramsci doesn't have much use for the base superstructure model, instead positing a complex unity of the economic, the political, and the ideological, here in the neutral sense, in the conception of the historic bloc, as he terms it, which he sees as decisive in the achievement of hegemony. He is, however, critical of the economic determinism that was influential among certain interpretations of Marxism, notably in the Second International. And that's what Western Marxism is particularly critical of in that sort of false consciousness notion of ideology. The ruling class dominance notion of hegemony, in one of Gramsci's most famous formulations, is consent protected by the armour of coercion. It's consent, but it's protected by the armour of coercion. Most of the time, subaltern strata concur with the social arrangements led by the ruling class. For example, by being convinced that the interests of the ruling class or its dominant fractions are the common interests of the people. This is an understanding found in Marx when he discusses ideology. Yet there's more than ideology at work here. The schools and the press have a positive pedagogical role here, but the courts have a negative pedagogical role, as Gramsci put it. Consent is elicited through the state apparatuses of hegemony, including schools and the media, but it's disciplined by coercion. As mentioned previously, the role of intellectuals organic to the ruling class is crucial in their retaining and maintaining hegemony, just as that of intellectuals organic to the working class will be in their prospective achievement of hegemony, For Gramsci, all people are intellectuals, though not all have the social function of intellectuals. Everyone is capable of critical thought, given suitable education, and it's the task of working class organic intellectuals to facilitate this. Already in their everyday practical understandings of the world, ordinary people have theoretical understandings that arise from and inform their practice. Their relationship between elaborated theory and everyday common sense, and the everyday common sense of the man in the mass, as Gramsci calls it, this relationship is a dialectical one. It goes two ways. Those with the social function of intellectuals take up the everyday concerns and contradictory understandings of the masses, render these into a more or less coherent theoretical form, which in turn is given back to the masses and grasped by them in a way that shapes their future everyday notions and activities. Excuse me. Traditional intellectuals do this in a way that articulates popular consciousness to the interests of the ruling class. Intellectuals organic to the working class need not only to articulate the interests of that class as experienced and understood by the masses, but to raise the level of understanding of the masses so that there is eventually no distinction between intellectuals and masses, between leaders and led. So despite the language of masses, this is a profoundly egalitarian, indeed revolutionary, conception of the intellectual and an anti-elitist notion of leadership. Ruling class hegemony thus works through the dominant fractions of the ruling class, managing, via the work of intellectuals and through the apparatuses of hegemony, to have their sectional interests represented as the general interest of the people, the nation. This is effective because the consciousness of the man in the mass is largely incoherent and riven with contradictions, arising from the contradictions in his daily life. An example would be the Sardinian peasant sent to Turin as a soldier to suppress the strikers. Seeing the workers as gentry with no interest in common with him, because they appear to him to be, well dressed and of a different set of material interests. Gramsci uses this the term common sense to denote these understandings, and I'd argue that this is in many ways consistent with the concept of ideology in the negative theory that we've earlier explored. Yet not all knowledge is ideology in that sense. Excuse me. For Gramsci, the practical activity of the working people engaged in the real world means that they possess what he calls good sense, which is the kernel of truth within the ideological shell of contradictory common sense. The kernel of truth within the contradictory shell. The pedagogical task of the working class organic intellectual then, excuse me, is to help extract that germ of good sense. That's how the Sardinian peasants of the Sassari Brigade could be largely dissuaded from the armed violence against the factory-occupying workers of Turin, which led the state to disband the brigade and send components of it to other parts of the country and send in fresh troops from elsewhere to crush the rebellion, such as the armour of coercion when consent is broken down. The ability of a ruling class to rely on such coercion is not a given, and it's not for all time. Hegemony is not merely an arrangement in the social structures at a given time. It's vitally involved in historical change. Through his historical analysis of past revolutionary periods, Gramsci identifies a progressive phase of hegemony when a leading alliance is forged, uniting classes in opposition to the dominant ones of the old order in their worldview and their politics. If their struggle is successful, they build a new social order which is already prefigured within the disintegration of the old one. In framing this historical unity across economic, political and ideological aspects of social life that are in reality mutually constitutive, the leading class or fraction identifies interests in common with the subaltern strata, interests in common, right, in order to form alliance with them. This commonality of interest is real. I repeat, it's real. in revolutions of the past, once the old ruling classes were overturned, the leading force within the new hegemony lost its historically progressive role, and the hegemony was henceforth maintained to assert the domination of that class or fraction. In this non-revolutionary phrase, hegemony involves representing the interests of the ruling bloc as if they were held in common with the subaltern strata, which in reality they are not. This is a mystifying and falsifying sense of ideology, a familiar sense within historical materialism, as I've mentioned. It is in the historical process that the interests are created and that the correspondence to reality or otherwise of their commonalities is determined. It's important to stress that such progressive hegemonic alliances cannot simply be joined up willy-nilly, voluntaristically. Okay, you can't put them together at will any old way. The necessary shared interests are seen by Gramsci as real and material, while they are articulated in ideology in the neutral sense and asserted in politics. They're not merely a matter of discourse in the sense that became fashionable in the social sciences after the textual turn. Now, I'm not going to say anything more about that. I can in discussion if you like. But I want to conclude by emphasising that Gramsci's theory of hegemony deals with contradictions that he conceives as real, material, and historical, and he spends much of the notebooks analysing them in concrete detail in the Italian context. What I've argued is that in Gramsci's concept of disorganised common sense and its class-related distortions and misrecognition of interests, in which good sense remains accessible but repressed, we can find a useful theoretical tool that is consistent with the negative concept of ideology. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Scott. We've got a question. Before that, I can just see, I know here we have the understanding of the concept of ideologies taking more of a negative understanding, since it's related to hegemony and power and all the other aspects we spoke about. But we can also see it's coming from a sociology perspective, a philosophy perspective, where now it's currently more approached from a multidisciplinary perspective. For example, it's explained through textual analysis, it's explained through linguistics, and I can see it has more of a positive connotation in those fields. Do you agree on that?
Yes, the problem with a lot of the deployment of the concept of texts as if they were the social, as if our social reality was a text, is that ultimately, and crudely put, it's idealist. It's in one way it's a way of evading considering the reality of the underlying social relations, and of course many proponents of the textual turn deny that there's such a thing as a reality outside of the text, and repudiate the notion of determination by the social relations of production, but they're real. They're still there, and they still go on. They still go on affecting our social lives, whether semioticians recognise it very much, or concentrate on it, or choose not to. That is, it's a political choice ultimately, and I think that those politics have important consequences. The textual turn, if you like, maybe in the 1980s, was concomitant with what's been called the retreat from class, and the rejecting the notion of class relations, either of class relations as determinant of political and consciousness aspects of social life, and also rejecting the concept of the working class as the leading force for progressive social change. The reasons for doing that were pretty obvious, as I mentioned before, because of the discrediting of the Soviet Union, and because of the type of historical materialism that was seen to lead inevitably to that. Although it's interesting that at the same time as thinking that, the notion of inevitability itself is repudiated as totalising. But leave that aside. The proponents of that worldview wanted to look to other progressive social forces, and perhaps a coalition of other progressive social forces that were not class-based, in order to produce progressive social change.
Mm-hmm. Yep, thank you. Before we take our 2 or 3 minute break to get our coffees, I'll take a question from Robert. He asked, does the spirit divide ideology and religion?
The spirit?
Mm-hmm. Robert, would you like to unmute yourself, maybe explain your question further?
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Are you still with us, Robert? Yes, I can see you are.
It's the transcendent. Sorry. In other words, ideologies are, we could say, physical, dealing with the materialistic world, which you've basically said. So the religious incorporates the transcendent, whereas the ideologies don't normally do that. Sorry. Someone else said it there too, I think.
Marx begins his project with a critique of Hegel, and with an argument that that it's not useful to conceive of the transcendent producing the human condition, and so I think he himself says, or perhaps others have said, that he stands Hegel on his head to that extent, or more properly, stands Hegel on his feet, right? So he's arguing from, what I quoted before as real men in the flesh and their real concrete material activities, and that and from that religion arises not as some sort of essence, but as a projection of human beings' real needs and of the real suffering in their lives and the real contradictions that they live, and they seek a resolution of that in another world where they, where they project. Now, many would regard that as disrespectful or even blasphemous, but that was Marx's position. Have I understood you correctly?
I think yes, we could say a touchy subject, and it's a political hot potato, but
of course it is. Yeah.
It's really what I'm trying to say is that in some ways religion can't be explained in ideology terms, yet it has got this physical element to it as well. So I acknowledge those elements there, and it is a delicate, very sensitive area for most people who are of religious commitment. And
for that reason, I did wonder about whether I should even mention it in this particular forum. But it is where Marx and Engels and the tradition that they came from began their journey of developing the theory of ideology. And you can understand ideology in the sense that I was explicating without entirely without introducing the question of whether without worrying about discussing religion and characterising it as ideology. There's no doubt that Marx did. I should say that later on, Gramsci he was much more pragmatic about relationships to religion, and thought that it was stupid to be disparaging of religion if religion was so much a part of the popular consciousness in the 1920s and first half of the 30s of ordinary Italians. And if you wanted to mobilise and speak to and educate and form alliances with these people, then it wasn't very helpful if you suggested that their ways of that their church was ideological. But he does tell, he does make some criticisms about about priests of various sorts, and about the intellectuals of the church and the way that they ally themselves with the ruling class, and that's been a long-standing bone of contention.
Yes,
thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Robert.
Thank you. I think we've covered it as well as we can.
Okay, thank you.
In the circumstance. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take that to our 3-minute break. We will have sort of an engaging discussion for those who don't want to grab coffee or tea while you come back. After that, we'll have our discussion and more questions, and maybe we can unpack ideology a bit more with Scott. We've got some questions coming in just to simplify and define it further. We'll do that later, but now please feel free to have your coffee or tea. Some people don't want coffee or tea. We'll just go through a bit of a discussion related to COVID and our situation.
Okay,
now,
thank you, Mona. I'm going to go and do that and have that coffee and tea.
Go for it.
See you.
No worries. I just thought if someone wants to tell us a bit of a story, while I know everyone's studying online, meetings online, interviews online, our classes during COVID. There's so many funny stories happening to people while they're in their meetings. Since they're at home, some family members don't understand the fact that, okay, we're at work or we're into something serious. We have Dr. Zaliha. She's not with us today. I found that very, very cute. She had her cat interrupting in one of her meetings and crawling in front of her. Another lecturer, she's actually my daughter's lecturer, and her daughter asked for a snack. She had to apologize, leave. She left the camera, she left the everything on, and she said, I have to go give her ice cream to my daughter. I went to the fridge, gave her ice cream, came back, explained. She said to the students, this is our reality. I have to stay calm and just go ahead. So if anyone wants to unmute and share their stories, we would like to hear a bit of everyone's story during these times. We'll take it a bit funny and positively, not take the negative side of COVID. Drago, I think that's Vicky. Would you like to tell us anything about your cat?
I was involved in a project just recently. It was just a 10-day project, had to have meetings every day, and every day Alina, she's the cat, she would come into the conversation every day, and she had to say her piece about how the project was going.
That is so amazing. I find it so cute. I saw it actually a couple of times on social media where people are sharing how their pets are, interfering during their meetings. And and then there's heaps and heaps of stories of people joining with the camera off because they're in their pajamas, and then the camera suddenly goes on. It's very funny. Thanks for sharing, Vicky. Anyone else that wants to share? I guess everyone's having their coffee or tea. I'm not a coffee or tea person, so I'm fine. I would actually, I want to inform you, at ISRA we're having coming up a webinar with Dr. Craig Considine. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name. So this is going to be a webinar with Professor Mehmed, where he would actually talk about his book that he published in this year, in 2020. And the book is titled The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View. In this live webinar, they'll be discussing the Prophet Muhammad and how he reacted to racism, etc., based on a Christian author that wrote about the Prophet. I'll be sharing here the link. Yep, I've got the link here. If anyone's interested, you can just go to the link, register, and it's on Friday, the 25th of September, 7:30 p.m. and it's online. As we all said, as we just said, everything's online now, but it has its positive side. We can get our audience from overseas to join us and meet new people and interact. Now that Professor Scott is back, if you guys have any questions or discussions, please feel free. We had a question, Scott, please, before we took our break, from Babel again. She was asking an important question, actually. I wanted to ask that question. Can we unpack ideology? Babel is asking, what does ideology actually mean? What's the definition? How can we define it? You're on mute, by the way.
Sorry, I'm not very good with the technology.
That's fine.
It's got many different meanings. And what I was arguing tonight was that we can talk about two different traditions of using the notion of ideology. And controversially, I was arguing that the negative concept that's propounded by Jorge Larraín is and developed pretty much directly from Marx is quite compatible with what Larraín calls a neutral form of ideology that he says Gramsci is elaborating his theory of hegemony with. There's a notion of criticism in both, but in both in the notion of common sense in Gramsci and in ideology in the sense that Marx and Larraín are using it. Larraín all the time, Marx some of the time. How did I start that sentence? So there's a critical sense. I mean, there are other more anodyne concepts of ideology, but because they're anodyne and not critical and not so engaged with the world of politics where social change takes place, then I find them less interesting. And I find less effective the retreat into textualism within social science of those theorists who say that they're pursuing progressive social change. But it seems to me that conceiving of forms of consciousness without a critical edge to that conception isn't very effective. So look, there's many ways of there's many ways of thinking ideology. What it means in social science often has to do with the pejorative notion that it's somehow a mystification. That this is this is often crudely, interpreted as a falsification of social reality. And there's other ways that just talk about it as ways of thinking about the world, of morality, of values and beliefs, and of acting in the world.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Scott. We've got a question also from David. He said, you've piqued my interest. Do you have any suggested readings on Gramsci, ideology and the Australian context?
Well, I a long time ago, I tried to use the Gramscian notion of civil society in analysing the racism and the retreat from multiculturalism that was one of the characteristics of the Howard government, and that was in a little edition of Social Alternatives that was devoted to looking at what it conceived of as the dismantling of, or disintegration of, or I forget the metaphor, of civil society. So I went back to Gramsci and looked at how the notion of civil society was deployed there, and you know, it's connected to hegemony, but it's not the same thing. All racism, I'd say, is ideological. It involves misrepresentation. It misunderstands the world, and it misunderstands the world in ways that have material effects, and that's why it happens, and that's how it works, crudely put.
Yeah, I've got Babel wants to just reply on your comment now. Go ahead, Babel, before we take other questions.
Yeah, I'm still pressing the buttons and everything. Yeah. Hello, Scott. I'm interested in the word of ideology, very, very much so, because, and you mentioned the word. Do you want me to put my camera on? You don't really want to see my face. You talked about.
Oh, we lost you, Babel. I think your internet is cutting off.
Ideology and capitalism.
Oh, that's Zoom for you.
And all of this, and I'm sort of.
Babel, I'll have to cut you off.
That wouldn't surprise me.
Your Zoom, your internet. Yeah, we couldn't hear you.
Maybe if
I
you
turn off my video.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Can turn off. Can you hear?
No, we can't hear you. Maybe type your question and I'll ask it for you.
I think you've turned off you've muted your voice. That's why we can't hear you.
Yeah. Maybe you can type your question and I'll ask. In the meanwhile, can you ask your question, Hila? You had a question.
Oh no, you're talking to me?
No,
sorry?
I was asking you, Babel, if you can type your question because we can't hear you properly, please.
Well, maybe we can hear her all right if she's turned the video off.
It's not just one question. I just want to make a discussion about the idea.
I think we can hear okay now that the video is off and not using up the bandwidth.
Yeah. Oh, look, I'm out in the bush, and I say, if a kookaburra flies over the disc, I'm stuffed. You know.
We had a kookaburra here in Newtown this morning.
Oh, good.
Sorry, go on.
So I'm going all right at the moment. I'd just like to introduce myself. I got a PhD in philosophy, and I've just graduated, and it was 90% studio-based practice and 30% exegesis.
Congratulations.
And yeah, oh look, thank you. I need more congratulations than that, but the idea of ideology, and I've used that word a lot, and it concerns me particularly about the English language in that certain words are contextualized, boxed, confirmed, boxing an idea in something. So I'm worried about that. It's framing, and it also brings up a what do you call it? A preconceptive idea about us. But I think there's a historical change in ideology, and particularly with the COVID virus and what's happening with climate change and with politics. Is that the word ideology is not stuck in the Marxist view in a way. It has some
changed.
I guess you can say metamorphized to a different context to where we are living now. Like you were talking about Marx, and I've read about that, and ideology, and Marx said ideology is an unreal concept.
Sure.
But
Look, however,
I think
I'm just conscious of time, Barbel. Can because we've got like 3 other questions.
all right.
however you use the concept.
Just my main point. Just my main point is the idea of ideology. The word is metamorphizing into our current situation, which is different to probably the Marxist view or the post-world view.
Of course it is. I mean, we'd be very surprised if things in 2020 were much the same as they were in, the 1850s. And that was a point I started out with in talking about theory, that, theories have to be useful for understanding the world, for explaining the world, and particularly for understanding a changing world and for making change in the world. And so, the test of whether ideology, even ideology in the way that Marx used it, is a useful concept, is whether or not we can use it today about a contemporary phenomena, and I think we can, and that's why I gave examples of Black Lives Matter and of Trump and of populism and nationalism spreading globally, because that's happening right now. From India to Brazil to the Philippines, as well as the United States, and not unrelated, by the way, also with COVID. A lot of those are the places that are coping worst with it. I wonder if that's a coincidence. But the point is that it's not a question of departing from or remaining faithful to the Marxist canon, but whether concepts that we can take from it are useful in today's context. And I think it's useful. I think we do see reality inverted in ideological uses all the time, and that has real effects.
Yeah. On the same line, I've just got a question from Holly that similar to that can add to what you're discussing. He's asking: is working class racism a form of disorganized common sense? And can we have our answers short, please, Scott, because we've got other questions coming up?
Yes. How short do you want it? Yes. Yes, it is.
It is.
I think so.
Okay. So we'll have Hila that wants to ask a question verbally. Can you go ahead, Hila, please?
Yeah, thanks, Mona. Thanks, Scott, for the great talk. Hi. Just wanted to clarify something. As you mentioned, according to the theory of hegemony and according to Gramsci's theory of hegemony, and looking at the dominance of the ruling class by consent enforced by coercion by states apparatus, would public policy be considered as states' coercive apparatus, especially in democratic political systems?
Okay, take the example of Black Lives Matter, right? then when you send in federal forces to deal with people with batons and gas and bullets, that's coercion, right? When you use channel TV or Twitter or whatever to convince people that, you know, there's dark forces out there and you know, that must be confronted to make America great again, etc., etc., etc. You know, to the extent that people are convinced by that and go along with the politics that are justified by that sort of ideology, then that's consent. But consent doesn't work for all people all of the time, and when it doesn't work, the state resorts to coercion.
Thank you. We've got a question. Sorry, Hila.
Yeah, and it's policy considered as that coercive apparatus of the state. What policy, public policy, implement certain policies against subordinate class be considered as that? Certain public policies, like a soft form of coercion still?
Okay, the policies themselves aren't apparatuses, but they can be propounded by apparatuses. So, you know, educational and research institutions, media institutions, think tanks, these are all ideological apparatuses of the state.
We've got Amira from Malaysia that wants
to
ask a verbal question. Thank you, Hila. Amira, can you go ahead, please? If you can make your question short, we have to wrap up soon. Amira? Amira's still there? Yeah, Amira? Go ahead, please. You're unmuted, Amira. You can speak. Yeah, I think Amira can't hear us, or maybe we can't hear her, but she's not on mute. Sorry, Amira, if you can hear us, can you please type in your question? It seems like we can't hear you. In the meanwhile, I'll just let you know that this session is recorded for future use. SISAC is actually, SISAC block is under construction, and in the next couple of months we will have it ready, and that's where we're going to be uploading all the readings and recordings for theory time. We've got your emails, so we'll be sending you an email informing you of the recordings that will be, and sending you the links so you can access those recordings for future use when it's ready. I think Amira couldn't get in contact with us. I think we'll have to wrap up here though. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me if I didn't cover any or forgot to look at anyone's question. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much, Scott, for this very insightful and informative presentation. And for those who joined us from overseas, we'll tell you thank you. We know you joined, although there's a difference in time. And please remind your friends and colleagues that we will have our next theory time in the next, like bi-monthly, not next month, the month after. We will inform you by email. Amira just typed in her question. I will take it, Amira. She says, I already read a thesis given by email. So cultural hegemony, at least I understand from this discussion, where he wrote about it from the books, I mean. Don't really, did you understand the question, Scott?
Maybe it'd help if I read it. I'll have a look in the chat box.
Yeah. think she's talking about culture hegemony.
No, I'm afraid I don't understand the...
Yeah. Okay then, thanks again, and please, sorry Amira, unfortunately we couldn't connect with you, and we'll see you.
If you'd like to send me an email and put it in other words, I'd be very happy to answer it as best I can.
Oh great, thank you Scott. Did you hear that, Amira? If you're still online and you can still hear us, you can send Professor Scott Poynting a question and he'll be able to answer that. Okay, you have a great evening, everyone, and thanks again. Good night for those who are going to sleep, and a good read for those who are going to read. I know, Scott, you said you have some readings. So do I.
Thank you, Mona, for your chairing, and thank you, everybody, for your attention and your participation.
Thank you.
Bye.
God bless.